In March 2013, paramedics found 27-year-old Charlotte Monroe collapsed on the front porch of her suburban home in Oak Ridge, just outside Chicago. Her body was convulsing, her breath shallow, and traces of poison lingered in the wine glass beside her. Against all odds, she survived. As detectives began their investigation, they uncovered a chilling betrayal, a secret affair, a dangerous obsession, and a best friend willing to kill. It all started on February 14th, 2013, the night of Charlotte's wedding, when a single mistake set off a chain of events that would lead to a horrifying attempt on her life. It was a bitterly cold night in Oak Ridge, a suburb just outside Chicago, the kind of night where the wind carried a sharp edge, cutting through even the thickest of coats. The quiet streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement behind warmly lit windows. It was a place where people went to sleep early, where nothing ever truly disturbed the peace. Until 11:52 p.m. A frantic call shattered the stillness. A neighbor, an older man who had been watching the late-night news, had gone outside to take his trash to the curb. It was routine, something he did every night without a second thought. But on this night, his gaze was drawn to the house across the street, the Monroe residence. At first, it was just a shape, a crumpled figure on the porch unmoving. A dark liquid smeared against the wooden steps, something thick, something unnatural. His first thought was that someone had spilled something, that maybe a pet had knocked over a drink. But then he stepped closer. He saw the delicate fingers twitching, the body struggling to move. He saw the pale skin, the way the breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, and then he saw her face. He recognized Charlotte Monroe instantly, the newlywed, the woman who had moved into the house just a few weeks ago, her laughter once a familiar sound in the neighborhood. But now, her face was contorted in agony, her lips trembling, a thin line of foam bubbling at the corners of her mouth. She was dying, right there on the porch of her new home. The man didn't hesitate. He ran back inside, hands shaking as he fumbled for the phone. His voice was uneven when he spoke to the dispatcher, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't process. He didn't know what had happened, only that something was terribly wrong. When the paramedics arrived, they worked quickly, their movements swift and practiced. One of them knelt beside Charlotte, checking her pulse, feeling the weak thump beneath the skin. Another carefully turned her onto her side, preventing her from choking on the foam that dripped from her lips. She was convulsing, her limbs jerking violently, her body fighting against whatever was inside her. Then came the glass. A single, delicate wine glass tipped over beside her, its contents staining the wooden planks. The paramedics didn't need to be detectives to recognize something was off. The way her body was reacting, this wasn't a simple accident, nor was it an allergic reaction. This was poison. They wasted no time. Charlotte was lifted onto the stretcher, her body limp now, her struggles slowing. One of the paramedics glanced back at the house. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The inside was dark, the silence stretching. Something about it felt wrong. They sped towards St. Agnes Hospital, sirens cutting through the night, but even as they raced against time, Charlotte's pulse weakened. For a moment, it seemed like she was slipping away, but Charlotte Monroe was stronger than anyone realized. The hospital was unusually quiet when detectives Noah Landry and Olivia Hayes arrived at 6 a.m. The overnight staff moved in hushed voices, the soft beeping of machines filling the empty spaces. Room 412 was at the end of the hall, a small, sterile room where the woman everyone now called a miracle lay recovering. The doctors had done everything they could. The poison, whatever it was, had nearly shut down her organs. But somehow, against all odds, she survived. Detective Landry stood just outside the door, flipping through his notepad, going over the details of what little they knew so far. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just a woman, poisoned, alone on her porch. He hated cases like these, the ones where nothing made sense. Detective Hayes, younger and sharper in her instincts, watched Charlotte through the small glass window of the door. She looked fragile, too fragile for someone who had survived such a close call with death. Her breathing was steady, her fingers twitching slightly against the blankets. The doctors had warned them she might not wake up for another day. She had been through too much, her body was too weak. But Charlotte did wake up. It was slow at first, her eyelashes fluttering, her chest rising in a deeper breath. Landry stepped into the room just as her eyes snapped open. For a moment, she was silent. Then came the fear. She remembered. The look in her eyes said it all. Landry had been a detective long enough to recognize pure terror. Charlotte's lips parted, her breath shallow. She struggled to speak, her throat still raw from what had been done to her. But she forced the words out, even as her body trembled. She didn't hesitate, not even for a second. And when she spoke, her voice was weak, but certain. She said a name that changed everything. Sophia did this. By 2:30 p.m. the next day, Sophia Caldwell was in handcuffs. She had been at her apartment downtown when the officers arrived. She didn't scream, she didn't protest, she just stood there, watching them with an unreadable expression. Inside her home, detectives moved quickly. The first officer found the laptop, open a search history that sent a chill through the room. How much poison does it take to kill someone? Best undetectable toxins. How fast does poison work? Then there was the text message. It was from Daniel Monroe, Charlotte's husband. A simple message, a warning. If you keep this baby, I will tell her everything. That was the moment everything became clear. Charlotte had been poisoned by someone she trusted, someone she had known for years, her best friend. And now that best friend was being shoved into the back of a police car, hands cuffed tightly behind her back. She didn't say a word, not as the reporters swarmed, not as the cameras flashed, not as her face was plastered on every news station in the city. Sophia Caldwell had tried to kill her best friend, and now she would have to answer for it. The 14th of February, 2013, had been a day of celebration, love, and promises. It had been a day of vows spoken under a sky painted with the soft hues of a winter sunset. The wedding had been perfect, too perfect, the kind of perfection that almost felt like a carefully painted illusion. Charlotte Monroe had been glowing, her eyes full of dreams as she walked down the aisle toward the man she believed was her future. Daniel Monroe, standing at the altar in a crisp black suit, had looked just as perfect, a man deeply in love with the woman before him. His hands had been steady, his voice unwavering, as he had pledged his life to hers. But deep inside, buried beneath his composed exterior, was something darker, guilt, a thick, suffocating weight that clung to him like a shadow. Among the guests, hidden within the sea of familiar faces, was Sophia Caldwell, Charlotte's best friend since childhood. She had been there for every milestone in Charlotte's life, the heartbreaks, the career successes, the dreams whispered over late-night phone calls. She had been the one to wipe Charlotte's tears when love had failed her before. But that night, as Charlotte danced in the arms of her new husband, Sophia's smile had been forced. The joy she pretended to feel was nothing but a mask, one that threatened to crack with every passing second. because just hours before Charlotte had walked down the aisle, Sophia had been in a hotel room with Daniel Monroe. It hadn't been planned, it hadn't even been intentional, but that didn't change the fact that it had happened. One night, one mistake, Charlotte had been with her bridesmaids getting ready in the suite next door, laughing and sipping champagne, unaware that the two people she trusted most had just crossed a line that could never be undone. Daniel had been drinking, so had Sophia. The wedding had been approaching fast, and the weight of it all had been crushing him. He had stepped out, needing air, needing space. And then Sophia had been there, her presence familiar, her voice soft, asking him if he was nervous. He hadn't meant to kiss her. He hadn't meant for it to turn into something more, but it had. And once it started, neither of them had stopped it. For Daniel, it had been a moment of weakness, but for Sophia, it had been something else entirely. She had always loved Daniel, not just as Charlotte's husband-to-be, but in a way that had been hidden beneath years of suppressed emotions. She had been jealous of Charlotte, though she had never admitted it, not even to herself. Charlotte had always been the one with the perfect love stories, the happy endings. Sophia had always been the friend who stood on the sidelines, watching, waiting. But that night, Daniel had been hers, even if only for a few hours. By the time morning came, he had regretted it, deeply, but regret didn't erase reality. As the sun rose on the morning of the wedding, they had both agreed never to speak of it again. Never to tell Charlotte. Never to let it stain what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. So Daniel had stood at the altar, looking into his bride's eyes, promising her forever, while Sophia had stood among the bridesmaids, forcing herself to clap, to smile, to pretend. By March 2nd, 2013, at 10 p.m., everything had changed. Sophia had spent the last few weeks battling something she couldn't ignore: nausea, fatigue, a growing suspicion that had been confirmed the moment she took the pregnancy test. She was pregnant. She had sat on the bathroom floor of her apartment, staring at the test, her heart hammering against her ribs. There had only been one possibility, one moment in time that had led to this. Daniel. That realization had been like a knife twisting deep inside her. Because she had known, even before she told him, that this wasn't the kind of secret he could keep buried. She had gone to the Monroe house uninvited that night, knocking on the door with shaking hands. When Daniel had opened it, his face had gone pale the moment he saw her expression. The conversation that followed had been tense, quiet, dangerous. He hadn't wanted to hear it. He had wanted it to go away. But Sophia had made it clear she wasn't going to get rid of it. Daniel had felt the walls closing in, the world he had built with Charlotte slipping through his fingers. He had sat down, his head in his hands, knowing there was only one way forward. He had to tell Charlotte. If Sophia kept the baby, there was no hiding it. The truth would come out, and when it did, it would destroy everything. And for Sophia, that had been the worst betrayal of all. She had expected him to choose her, to fight for her, to say that this was fate, that their one night together had meant something more. Instead, he had made it clear Charlotte was his future, not her. And something inside Sophia had snapped. By March 4th, 2013, Sophia had already made up her mind. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, her thoughts had turned dark. The love she had felt for Daniel had twisted into bitterness, into resentment. Charlotte had always won, always. Even now, after everything, Daniel still chose her. Sophia couldn't let that happen. Her fingers had hovered over the keyboard before she started to type. What poisons leave no trace? Fastest acting liquid poison. How long does poison take to kill someone? She had scrolled through websites, reading about substances that were colorless, tasteless, efficient. She had learned about toxins that shut down organs before doctors could even diagnose what had happened. Charlotte was in the way, and if she was gone, Daniel would have no choice but to turn to her. She had spent the next few days planning, preparing, waiting for the right moment, for the perfect opportunity, for the chance to make sure that Charlotte Monroe would never be a problem again. The night was calm on March 6th, 2013 at 11 p.m., the kind of evening where the air carried the faint scent of earth after a late winter drizzle. The back patio of the Monroe home was softly illuminated by the porch lights, casting a warm glow over the wooden deck. The neighborhood was quiet, the distant hum of traffic barely reaching the secluded yard. It was the perfect place for a conversation, for laughter, for two friends to unwind after long days, or at least that's what Charlotte Monroe had believed. She had been feeling uneasy for weeks now, something in her marriage feeling slightly off, as if she were standing on unsteady ground without knowing why. Daniel had changed. His touch was different, his presence distant, his laughter less frequent. And then there was Sophia Caldwell, her best friend, her constant. She had been acting differently too, more reserved, more tense, her eyes carrying something unspoken every time Charlotte looked at her. Still, Charlotte had wanted to push those feelings away, at least for one night. She had suggested they spend time together, just the two of them, the way they always had before she became a wife. A girls' night, as they used to call it. Sophia had agreed immediately, and now here they were. The wine glasses were filled. The night sky stretched above them, and the air between them felt almost normal. Charlotte had laughed at something, the sound soft but genuine, and for a moment the unease faded. Sophia had smiled too, but there was something wrong with that smile. It was too careful, too perfect. Her fingers didn't tremble as she lifted the wine glass toward Charlotte, her voice light, her tone almost gentle. Charlotte had taken the glass without question. The first sip was smooth, the second even better. The warmth of the alcohol had barely settled in before something changed. The first wave of pain had been subtle, a slight tightening in her stomach, a discomfort that felt almost normal at first. But then it grew, fast. Charlotte had gasped, her throat tightening, the air refusing to fill her lungs properly. A deep, raw burn began to claw its way up from her stomach, her hands instinctively gripping the edges of the patio table. Her body felt wrong, as if something inside her was turning against itself. And across from her, Sophia had just watched. She had made no move to help, no expression of concern, just watching, waiting. It should have been over quickly. That had been the plan. Sophia had expected her body to shut down within minutes for the poison to do its job before Charlotte had the chance to fight back. But Charlotte was stronger than she had expected. By 11:45 p.m., Charlotte had collapsed from the chair, her body convulsing, her hands clawing at her throat as she fought to breathe. The pain was unbearable, her vision blurring as the world tilted and spun. Her chest burned, her limbs felt weak, but even as her body tried to give up, something inside her refused. With the last ounce of strength she had, she moved. Her hands, trembling and slick with sweat, dug into the wooden deck as she pulled herself forward. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there. The house was dark, empty, cold, but outside there was light. She crawled. Each movement sent another wave of agony through her body, her legs barely working beneath her. The pain blurred everything, but she kept going. She reached the porch. Her fingers grasped the edge of the steps, her body trembling as she tried to pull herself forward. The air outside felt different, crisper, clearer, but it still wasn't enough. Her lungs weren't working, her stomach felt like it was being ripped apart from the inside, and the darkness was closing in. She was losing. The last thing she saw before the world disappeared entirely was the flash of headlights, the shape of a figure moving toward her, and the sound of a voice calling her name. Then, everything went black. By the morning of March 9th, 2013, everything had changed. The arrest had been swift. Sophia Caldwell, once a trusted friend, had been pulled from her apartment by detectives who had spent the past 2 days piecing together the truth. There was no denying it. The evidence was overwhelming. Charlotte had survived. And in those painful, uncertain hours at the hospital, she had named her attacker. The detectives had found the search history. Clear, calculated searches about poisons, how they worked, how quickly they acted. They had found the text messages between Sophia and Daniel Monroe, the words filled with tension and desperation. The poisoned wine glass, once so delicate, now held the fingerprints of a murderer. At first, Sophia had denied everything. She had tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to twist the facts. But the truth was written all over her face, in the way her hands shook, in the way she refused to meet their eyes. And when they pressed her, when they cornered her with the undeniable evidence, her voice had broken. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. But it had happened. And now, there was no undoing it. By June 2013, the trial had concluded. The courtroom had been packed, filled with people who had once known Sophia, people who had once trusted her. The jury had taken just 4 hours to decide her fate. Life in prison, no parole. There had been no remorse, no last-minute apology, no words of regret. Sophia had sat there, her face blank, as the sentence was read. As for Daniel Monroe, he had been given full custody of the child Sophia would never get to raise, the same child that had led to everything falling apart. Charlotte had survived, but she was not the same woman she had been before. Her body had healed, but the scars left behind were deeper than anyone could see. She had been a woman who trusted too easily, who loved too deeply, and in the end, she had been betrayed by the two people she had trusted most, her husband and her best friend. She had walked into marriage thinking she had a lifetime ahead of her. Instead, she had walked into a nightmare. It had been exactly 1 year since Charlotte Monroe had fought for her life on that cold wooden porch. 1 year since she had tasted death on her lips, her body betraying her as poison coursed through her veins. 1 year since Sophia Caldwell, the woman she once called family, had tried to take everything from her. March 2014 had arrived quietly. The cold winds of winter had faded into softer breezes, and the world outside had begun to bloom again. But inside Charlotte's new home, the air still felt heavy. She had moved 6 months ago, far from Oak Ridge, far from the whispers, the lingering stares, the pity-filled eyes of neighbors who still looked at her like she was a ghost. But even in a different city, in a house with no painful memories, sleep still felt distant. The nightmares never truly left. Some nights, she would wake up gasping for air, the phantom feeling of burning liquid in her throat, her hands clawing at sheets instead of the cold wood of her porch. Other nights, she would hear a voice that wasn't there, a whisper, a memory, a betrayal she could never forget. She had tried to move forward, to build a life beyond the past, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. And then, on a quiet morning in March 2014, the letter arrived. She had found it in her mailbox, wedged between meaningless bills and supermarket flyers. A plain white envelope, no return address, no markings, nothing to suggest it was anything important. At first, she had almost ignored it, but something about it felt wrong. She had opened it with steady hands, but by the time her eyes landed on the single line inside, her breath had caught in her throat. "I'll see you again someday. S." The letters were perfectly formed, written in a familiar hand. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she stared at the words, her pulse pounding in her ears. The world around her blurred, the air feeling too tight, the walls too close. Sophia was in prison. Locked away, gone. So how had she sent this? 100 thoughts crashed into her mind at once. Was it real? Was someone playing a sick joke? Was Sophia watching her even from behind bars? The rational side of her knew the truth. Prisons had ways, people had ways. A letter wasn't impossible, but the weight of those words felt personal, felt intentional. The betrayal had never left her, and now it never would. She dropped the letter, the paper fluttering to the floor, the ink standing out like a scar against the pale surface. Some betrayals never fade, some ghosts never rest, and some stories never truly end. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case we have, the case where a wife discovers her husband's secret family on a grocery trip. Make sure to check it out and let us know what you think in the comments section.